Venezuela shows the limits of U.S. force. Let me take you back to April 30, 2019, a date that, at first glance, seemed like just another chaotic moment in Venezuela's long descent into crisis. That morning, a small group of opposition figures, backed by a handful of defecting soldiers, gathered near an airbase in eastern Caracas and released a video declaring the final phase of their uprising against Nicolas Maduro. Within hours, the U.S. government, led by then National Security Advisor John Bolton, was on the airwaves, framing the event as a decisive turning point. Bolton, standing outside the White House with a notepad that ominously read 5,000 troops to Colombia, made it the U.S. was all in. The message was Maduro's days were numbered, and American power would ensure his swift removal. At the time, I remember watching the coverage and feeling a deep unease. Not because I doubted the U.S. military's ability to crush Venezuela's defenses. Any serious analyst knows that, in a direct confrontation, the outcome wouldn't be in question. No, my concern was something far more: the assumption that force could solve what was, at its core, a political and geopolitical problem. That day in April wasn't just another failed coup attempt. It was a microcosm of a much larger truth, one that Washington still refuses to accept. Venezuela isn't just a test of American will, it's a case study in the limits of U.S. power in the 21st century. I've spent the better part of 3 decades studying the intersection of military force and geopolitics, from the Balkans to Iraq to Ukraine. And if there's one lesson that keeps repeating itself, it's the U.S. can still win wars, but it can no longer dictate the peace. Venezuela is the latest proof of that hard reality. The mainstream narrative, pushed by policymakers, amplified by think tanks, and parroted by much of the media, goes something like: Maduro is a dictator clinging to power through repression and fraud, his regime is a narco-state propped up by Russia and China, and the U.S. has both the moral obligation and the practical means to remove him. The solution, we're told, is a mix of sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and, if necessary, military pressure. The Venezuelan people are suffering, the argument goes, and only decisive American action can end their misery. The official data seems to back this up. The U.S. Treasury has sanctioned over 150 Venezuelan officials and entities, freezing billions in assets and crippling the country's oil exports, the lifeblood of its economy. The State Department has recognized opposition leader Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's legitimate president, a move echoed by more than 50 countries. The Pentagon has conducted high-profile military exercises with regional allies, including Colombia and Brazil, while U.S. Southern Command has repeatedly warned of Russian and Iranian influence in Caracas. In 2020, the Trump administration even indicted Maduro on drug trafficking charges, offering a $15 million bounty for his capture. The message was the U.S. was treating Venezuela like a rogue state, and regime change wasn't just a policy goal, it was an inevitability. But here's the problem with this: it assumes that Venezuela is a problem the U.S. can solve through pressure alone. It ignores the fact that Maduro has survived multiple coup attempts, mass protests, and crippling sanctions, not because he's popular, but because he's outmaneuvered his opponents at every turn. It overlooks the uncomfortable truth that Venezuela's crisis isn't just about Maduro, it's about a broken state, a fractured opposition, and a geopolitical landscape where the U.S. no longer calls all the shots. And most dangerously, it underestimates the resolve of Russia and China, who see Venezuela not as a humanitarian disaster, but as a strategic opportunity. Let me tell you what's really happening in Venezuela and why the U.S. approach is doomed to fail. The first thing you need to understand is that Maduro's survival isn't an accident. It's the result of a deliberate strategy, one that exploits the weaknesses in America's own playbook. Take the 2019 coup attempt. On paper, it looked like a slam: a few hundred soldiers, some high-profile defections, and a U.S. administration openly cheering from the sidelines. But what the U.S. didn't account for was Maduro's control over the military's upper echelons. The Venezuelan armed forces aren't a monolith, but the generals who matter, the ones who control the intelligence services, the oil industry, and the gold reserves, have been bought off. Not with ideology, but with cold, hard cash. The U.S. Treasury's own reports show that senior Venezuelan officials have siphoned billions from the state, often with the help of Russian and Chinese intermediaries. These aren't true believers in socialism, they're kleptocrats who know that their survival depends on Maduro's. And as long as they're getting rich, they're not going to switch sides. Then there's the opposition. For years, the U.S. has bet on Juan Guaidó as the face of Venezuela's democratic resistance. But Guaido's movement has been plagued by infighting, corruption scandals, and a fundamental lack of grassroots support. The opposition's biggest mistake? Assuming that US backing was enough to win. In reality, Guaido's legitimacy has always been a top-down construct, imposed by Washington and its allies. The Venezuelan people, meanwhile, are exhausted. They've lived through hyperinflation, mass blackouts, and a collapse in public services. They don't trust Maduro, but they don't trust the opposition either, not when it's seen as a vehicle for US intervention. This is the paradox of American regime change. The more the US pushes, the more it undermines the very people it claims to support. But the real story in Venezuela isn't just about Maduro's resilience or the opposition's failures. It's about the shifting balance of power in Latin America and the world. For decades, the US treated the Western Hemisphere as its exclusive sphere of influence. The Monroe Doctrine wasn't just a policy, it was an article of faith. But today, that faith is being tested like never before. Russia and China have made Venezuela a frontline in their broader competition with the US, and they're playing a long game. Let's start with Russia. Moscow's involvement in Venezuela isn't new. Hugo Chavez cultivated close ties with Putin's government years ago, but it has deepened dramatically under Maduro. Russian state-owned companies like Rosneft have invested billions in Venezuela's oil sector, often in exchange for future production rights. Russian military contractors, including the infamous Wagner Group, have provided security for Maduro and trained his forces. And in 2019, Russia sent 2 nuclear-capable bombers to Venezuela in a show of force that sent shockwaves through Washington. The message was, if the US tries to remove Maduro by force, Russia will respond. China's role is even more significant. Beijing has lent Venezuela over $60 billion since 2007, much of it secured against future oil deliveries. Unlike Western creditors, China hasn't demanded political reforms in exchange for its loans, it just wants its money back, in oil. And as Venezuela's economy has collapsed, China has become its largest creditor, giving Beijing unprecedented leverage. The US can sanction Venezuela all it wants, but as long as China keeps buying its oil, Maduro can weather the storm. This is where the geopolitical stakes get really interesting. Venezuela isn't just a failed state, it's a battleground in the new Cold War. For Russia, Venezuela is a way to distract the US from Ukraine and Syria. For China, it's a test case for its ability to challenge American dominance in Latin America. And for the US? It's a chance to reassert its influence in its own backyard, but only if it's willing to pay the price. Here's the US still has the military power to invade Venezuela. The Pentagon could deploy tens of thousands of troops, establish a no-fly zone, and topple Maduro in a matter of weeks. But what then? Iraq and Afghanistan taught us that removing a dictator is the easy part. The hard part is what comes in. Venezuela isn't a country with a functioning state, it's a hollowed-out shell, where institutions have collapsed, the economy is in ruins, and the population is deeply divided. Even if the US succeeded in removing Maduro, it would inherit a failed state and the responsibility for rebuilding it. This is the central flaw in America's Venezuela. It assumes that force can solve a problem that is fundamentally political. The US has tried sanctions, it's tried diplomacy, it's tried covert action. None of it has worked. And yet, the hawks in Washington keep pushing for more pressure, as if the next round of sanctions or the next coup attempt will finally break Maduro's grip. They're like gamblers at a casino, doubling down on a losing hand because they can't admit defeat. But here's where it gets even more complicated. Venezuela isn't just a foreign policy challenge, it's a domestic political issue in the US. Florida, with its large Venezuelan and Cuban exile communities, is a critical swing state. For politicians in both parties, taking a hard line on Venezuela isn't just about geopolitics, it's about winning votes. The Trump administration's Venezuela policy was driven as much by electoral calculations as by strategic ones. And now, with the 2024 election looming, the Biden administration is under pressure to show that it's tough on Maduro. This is the trap of American foreign policy in the 21st. Domestic politics distort strategic thinking. The US can't afford to look weak on Venezuela, so it keeps escalating even when escalation makes the problem worse. And the more the US pushes, the more it plays into the hands of Russia and China, who are happy to watch America get bogged down in another quagmire. So where does this leave us? Let's consider the scenarios. The best-case scenario is that Maduro eventually agrees to a negotiated transition, perhaps in exchange for sanctions relief and guarantees of immunity for himself and his inner circle. This is what the US and its allies have been pushing for, but the odds are slim. Maduro has no incentive to step down, and the opposition is too weak to force him out. Even if a deal were reached, it would likely collapse, as previous agreements have, because neither side trusts the other. The most likely scenario is that Venezuela remains in a state of perpetual crisis. Maduro stays in power, but his regime grows increasingly authoritarian and isolated. The economy continues to deteriorate, driving more Venezuelans to flee the country. The US maintains its sanctions, but they do little to change the political dynamic. Russia and China continue to prop up Maduro, but they don't have the resources to fix Venezuela's problems. The result is a slow-motion collapse, with no clear resolution in sight. The worst-case scenario is that the US decides to use military force. This could take the form of a limited strike, a naval blockade, or even a full-scale invasion. The immediate result would be a humanitarian catastrophe, as Venezuela's already fragile infrastructure collapses under the strain of war. The long-term result would be a protracted insurgency, as Maduro's loyalists and other armed groups resist US occupation. Russia and China would respond by increasing their support for Maduro, turning Venezuela into a proxy war. And the US would find itself stuck in another endless conflict, with no exit strategy. None of these scenarios are good. But the worst of them, the military option, is the one that some in Washington are still pushing for. And that should terrify anyone who understands the limits of American power. I'm not arguing that the US should do nothing about Venezuela. The country's crisis is a humanitarian disaster, and the US has a moral obligation to help. But the current approach, sanctions, diplomatic isolation, and the threat of force isn't working. It's time for a new strategy, one that recognizes the limits of American power and the realities of the 21st century. First, the US needs to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere in the short term. That doesn't mean the US should recognize his government or lift all sanctions, but it does mean acknowledging that regime change isn't a viable policy goal. Instead, the US should focus on mitigating the humanitarian crisis, supporting civil society, and keeping the door open for a negotiated solution. Second, the US needs to engage with Russia and China not as adversaries, but as stakeholders in Venezuela's future. Moscow and Beijing have a vested interest in stability, because instability threatens their investments. The US should explore whether there's room for cooperation on issues like debt restructuring, oil production, and counter-narcotics. This won't be easy, but it's better than the three-way proxy war. Third, the US needs to stop treating Venezuela as a domestic political issue. The Biden administration should resist the temptation to use Venezuela as a cudgel against Republicans, and Republicans should stop using it as a wedge issue. Venezuela's crisis is too serious to be reduced to partisan point scoring. Finally, the US needs to rethink its broader strategy in Latin America. For too long, Washington has treated the region as its backyard, intervening when it suits its interests and ignoring it when it doesn't. But the world has changed. Latin America is no longer a passive player in global politics. It's a region with its own agency, its own alliances, and its own interests. The US can't afford to keep treating it as a subordinate. Venezuela is a warning. It's a reminder that the US can't solve every problem with force, that its influence isn't what it used to be, and that its domestic politics often distort its foreign policy. The question isn't whether the US can still project power, it can. The question is whether it can do so wisely, in a world where its adversaries are more capable and its allies are more skeptical. I've been warning about this for years. The US is still the most powerful country in the world, but it's no longer the only one. And in a multipolar world, force alone isn't enough. Venezuela is the latest proof of that. The question is whether Washington will learn the lesson or keep repeating the same mistakes. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela isn't just a cautionary tale about the limits of US military power, it's a case study in how America's strategic assumptions about Latin America have become dangerously outdated. For decades, Washington operated under the belief that the region was a secondary theater, a place where the US could intervene at will without serious pushback from global rivals. That assumption held during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union's reach into the hemisphere was limited to Cuba and a handful of leftist insurgencies. But today? The game has changed entirely. Let me explain why this matters. In 2019, when the Trump administration recognized Juan Guaidó as Venezuela's interim president, it wasn't just making a diplomatic move, it was testing a new kind of hybrid warfare. The strategy combined economic sanctions, cyber operations, and a thinly veiled threat of military action to force regime change. The problem? It didn't account for the fact that Venezuela had already become a battleground for great power competition. Russia and China didn't just sit on the sidelines, they doubled down. Moscow sent Wagner Group mercenaries to protect Maduro, while Beijing extended billions in loans and technical support to keep Venezuela's oil industry afloat. The US found itself in a position it hadn't faced since the day of a direct confrontation with two nuclear-armed adversaries in its own backyard, with no clear path to victory. Here's the uncomfortable: the US military is still the most formidable force on the planet, but its ability to translate that power into political outcomes has eroded. In Venezuela, the Pentagon could have easily toppled Maduro, just as it did with Noriega in AMA in 1989 or Saddam in 2003. But what then? The US has no appetite for another nation-building project, and even if it did, the costs would be astronomical. The Iraq War cost over $2 trillion and 4,500 American lives, and that was in a country with a fraction of Venezuela's geopolitical baggage. The American public isn't willing to pay that price, and neither are its allies. Colombia, once a reliable US partner, has refused to host American troops for a potential invasion. Brazil, under Lula, has made it clear it won't back regime change. Even the OAS, long seen as a tool of US influence, has fractured over Venezuela. This brings me to the broader military implications. The US has spent the last 2 decades preparing for high-intensity conflicts with China and Russia, but Venezuela shows that the real challenge may be in the gray zone, the space between war and peace where economic coercion, proxy forces, and information warfare decide outcomes. The Pentagon's 2022 National Defense Strategy acknowledges this, but the institutional inertia is still overwhelming. The US military is built for large-scale conventional wars, not for countering Russian private military commies or Chinese economic statecraft. In Venezuela, the Wagner Group didn't just provide security, it embedded itself in the country's intelligence apparatus, trained local forces, and even helped Maduro's government evade sanctions. That's not something the US can counter with a carrier strike group. And then there's China. Most analysts focus on Beijing's military buildup in the South China Sea, but its real power projection in Latin America has been economic. Since 2005, China has loaned over $137 billion to the region, much of it to Venezuela. Those loans weren't just about securing oil, they were about building leverage. When the US imposed sanctions on Venezuela's oil industry, China stepped in with swap deals, allowing Maduro to keep selling crude despite the restrictions. The US can sanction all it wants, but as long as China and Russia are willing to absorb the costs, those sanctions will have limited effect. This is the new reality of great power. The US can't just impose its will anymore. It has to negotiate, and that requires a level of diplomatic sophistication that Washington has lost over the past 2 decades. The last time the US successfully mediated a major crisis in Latin America was the 1990s, when it brokered peace deals in Central America. Since then, the State Department's Latin America Bureau has been gutted, its expertise replaced by political appointees and short-term thinking. The result? A region where the US is still seen as the dominant power, but where its actual influence is declining. Let me give you an example. In 2021, the Biden administration quietly dropped its support for Guaidó, recognizing that the strategy had failed. But instead of pivoting to a new approach, it fell back on the same old: more sanctions, more rhetoric about democracy, and no real engagement with the opposition or the regime. Meanwhile, Russia and China kept deepening their ties with Caracas. In 2022, Maduro visited Beijing and secured a $4 billion credit line. That same year, Russia's foreign minister, Sergei Lavrov, toured Latin America, signing military cooperation agreements with Venezuela, Nicaragua, and Cuba. The message was: if the US won't engage, someone else will. This is the lesson Washington still refuses to learn. The US can't just walk away from Latin America, but it can't treat it as a subordinate either. The region is too important geopolitically, economically, and strategically. It's the source of 40% of US oil imports, a key battleground in the fight against drug trafficking, and a critical front in the competition with China. But if the US wants to maintain its influence, it needs to start treating Latin American countries as partners, not pawns. That means accepting that some governments, like Venezuela's, will remain hostile, but that doesn't mean they're beyond engagement. Look at Iran. The US has spent decades trying to isolate Tehran, but it still negotiates with the regime when it suits its interests. The same logic applies to Venezuela. The US doesn't have to recognize Maduro, but it does have to talk to him and to Russia and China if it wants to stabilize the country. The alternative is a slow-motion collapse that benefits no one. Venezuela's crisis is already spilling over into Colombia, Brazil, and the Caribbean. The US can't afford to ignore it, but it also can't solve it alone. The question is whether Washington is willing to adapt or whether it will keep pretending that the old rules still apply. Now, what most people don't realize is that Venezuela's domestic politics are far more fluid than the binary regime opposition narrative suggests. The establishment in Washington still clings to the idea that Maduro is a temporary aberration, a dictator propped up by brute force who will inevitably collapse under the weight of sanctions or popular revolt. But that's not how authoritarian resilience works in the 21st century. Maduro has survived not just through repression, though there's been plenty of that, but by mastering the art of controlled fragmentation. He's allowed just enough dissent to keep the opposition divided, just enough economic liberalization to prevent total collapse, and just enough external engagement to avoid complete isolation. Let me explain why this matters. In 2023, Maduro's government did something that should have set off alarm bells, and it held regional elections that, while neither free nor fair, were competitive enough to split the opposition. The main opposition coalition, the Unitary Platform, boycotted the vote in some states but participated in others, creating a patchwork of legitimacy that left no clear winner. The result? A fractured opposition, a regime that could claim it was allowing some political space, and a US policy that suddenly looked even more out of touch. The Biden administration had spent years insisting that free and fair elections were the only path forward, but when Maduro offered a simulacrum of democracy, the opposition couldn't agree on whether to play along. That's not incompetence on their part, it's the logical outcome of a system designed to keep them off balance. Here's the uncomfortable: Maduro isn't just surviving, he's adapting. In 2021, his government launched a cryptocurrency, the Petro, as a way to bypass US sanctions. It failed spectacularly, but the attempt revealed something important: Caracas is willing to experiment with economic models that don't rely on the dollar. More recently, Maduro has allowed limited dollarization in parts of the economy, a move that has stabilized some sectors while deepening inequality. The regime isn't trying to fix Venezuela's economy, it's trying to manage its decline in a way that keeps the elite in power. And it's working, at least for now. The opposition, meanwhile, is stuck in a cycle of hope and despair. In 2019, Juan Guaidó was hailed as the interim president by over 50 countries, including the US. By 2023, he was a marginal figure, his legitimacy eroded by infighting and the sheer difficulty of governing a country in absentia. The Unitary Platform has since splintered, with some factions pushing for negotiations with the regime and others insisting on a harder line. The problem isn't just that the opposition is divided, it's that the regime has made sure it stays that way. Maduro's strategy is to offer just enough concessions to keep the opposition guessing. A few political prisoners released here, a limited amnesty there, a promise of elections that may or may not happen. It's a classic divide and rule tactic, and it's working. So what does this mean for the future? I see three possible scenarios, none of them particularly optimistic for US interests. The first is what I call the managed decline scenario. In this version, Maduro continues to allow limited economic liberalization while maintaining tight political control. The regime survives, but Venezuela becomes a hollowed-out state, dependent on Chinese loans, Russian security guarantees, and whatever revenue it can squeeze out of its oil sector. The opposition remains fragmented, the economy limps along, and the US is left with a de facto failed state on its doorstep. This is the most likely outcome, and it's the one Washington seems least prepared to handle. The US has spent years trying to force a regime change, but it has no plan for what comes next if the regime doesn't fall. The second scenario is a sudden collapse, triggered by an economic shock or a split within the military. This is the outcome many in Washington still seem to hope for, but it's also the most dangerous. A rapid implosion could lead to mass migration, regional instability, and even a civil conflict. Colombia and Brazil are already struggling to absorb Venezuelan migrants. Imagine what would happen if millions more suddenly fled. The US would be forced to intervene, not out of choice but out of necessity, and it would do so without a clear strategy. We've seen this movie before in Iraq, in Libya, and it never ends well. The third scenario is the most unlikely but also the most negotiated transition. This would require Maduro to accept a power-sharing arrangement with the opposition, likely in exchange for sanctions relief and some form of amnesty. It's not impossible. Look at South Africa in the 1990s or Chile in the 1980s, but it would require a level of pragmatism that neither side has shown so far. The opposition would have to accept that Maduro isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and the regime would have to accept that it can't rule indefinitely without some form of legitimacy. The US could play a role here, but only if it's willing to engage with all parties, including Russia and China. That's a big if. The real problem, though, is that none of these scenarios align with the narrative that still dominates Washington's thinking. The establishment still believes that Venezuela is a problem that can be solved with the right mix of pressure and incentives. But Venezuela isn't a problem to be solved, it's a reality to be managed. The regime isn't going to collapse under sanctions, the opposition isn't going to unite behind a single leader, and the US isn't going to restore its influence by pretending that the old rules still apply. What's needed is a fundamental shift in how the US approaches Latin America. That means accepting that some governments will remain hostile, but that doesn't mean they're beyond engagement. It means recognizing that the region is no longer a subordinate sphere of influence, but a complex web of interests where the US is just one player among many. And it means understanding that the biggest threat to US interests isn't Maduro's survival, it's Washington's refusal to adapt. The question, then, isn't whether Maduro will fall. It's whether the US will finally realize that the game has changed and that it's time to start playing by new rules. Now, what most people don't realize is that this isn't just about Maduro or even Venezuela, it's about the broader collapse of the old Latin American order, and Washington's refusal to see it. The domestic political dimensions of Venezuela's crisis reveal something: a region where the traditional levers of US influence, economic coercion, diplomatic isolation, even covert action, no longer work the way they used to. And yet, the policy class in DC keeps reaching for the same tools, as if sheer repetition will somehow produce a different result. Let me explain why this matters. Venezuela's political landscape today is a fractured mess, but it's a mess with its own internal logic. Maduro's grip on power isn't just about repression, though there's plenty of that. It's about a system that has adapted to survive. The opposition, for all its moral high ground, remains divided between those who want to negotiate and those who still believe in a sudden, decisive rupture. The military, meanwhile, is neither a monolith nor a passive bystander. It's a network of factions, some loyal to the regime, others hedging their bets, and a few quietly positioning themselves for a post-Maduro future. This isn't a country on the brink of revolution, it's a country that has already undergone a slow-motion revolution, one where the old elites have been replaced by a new class of power brokers who have no interest in returning to the status quo ante. Here's the uncomfortable: Venezuela's domestic politics are now inseparable from its geopolitical reality. The regime's survival isn't just about oil or sanctions, it's about the fact that Maduro has successfully turned Venezuela into a client state for Russia and China, not out of ideological affinity, but out of necessity. Moscow and Beijing don't care about socialism, they care about leverage. And in Venezuela, they've found a way to keep the US bogged down in a low-intensity conflict that costs them little but forces Washington to expend political capital it can't afford to waste. Take the military, for instance. The conventional wisdom in Washington is that the armed forces are the key to Maduro's downfall, that if enough officers defect, the regime will collapse. But this ignores two critical factors. First, the military's top brass has been thoroughly purged of anyone who might pose a threat. Since 2018, Maduro has replaced over 60% of the high-ranking officers, promoting loyalists and sidelining potential rivals. Second, the military isn't just a tool of repression, it's an economic actor in its own right. The armed forces control everything from food distribution to gold mining, and they've been granted lucrative concessions in exchange for their loyalty. This isn't a military that's going to turn on Maduro because of US sanctions or moral appeals. It's a military that has a vested interest in the current system. Then there's the opposition. For years, Washington has bet on Juan Guaidó as the face of Venezuela's democratic resistance. But Guaidó's moment has passed. His approval ratings have plummeted from a high of 60% in early 2019 to barely 20% today, and his coalition has splintered. The problem isn't just that Guaidó failed to deliver, it's that the opposition as a whole has never offered a coherent alternative to Maduro's rule. They've been better at denouncing the regime than at governing, and that's a fatal flaw in a country where people are desperate for stability, not just change. This brings me to the most underappreciated aspect of Venezuela's: the exhaustion of the population. After years of hyperinflation, mass emigration, and state repression, most Venezuelans just want to survive. They're not rallying behind the opposition because they don't see a viable path to change. They're not rising up in the streets because they know the regime will crush them. And they're not pinning their hopes on the US because they've seen what happens when Washington tries to engineer regime change. The result is a kind of resigned stability, a population that has adapted to dysfunction because the alternatives seem worse. So where does that leave us? The most likely scenario, in my view, is a prolonged stalemate. Maduro isn't going anywhere, but neither is the opposition. The regime will continue to muddle through, relying on repression, patronage, and geopolitical allies to stay in power. The opposition will remain fragmented, with some factions pushing for negotiations and others holding out for a miracle. And the US will keep oscillating between sanctions and half-hearted attempts at diplomacy, never quite committing to either. But here's this stalemate isn't static. It's dynamic, and it's creating new realities on the ground. The longer the crisis drags on, the more Venezuela's institutions erode. The judiciary, the electoral council, even the legislature all have been hollowed out and replaced with loyalists. The economy, meanwhile, is becoming increasingly informal and criminalized. The state's capacity to govern is shrinking, but its capacity to survive is growing. This isn't a country on the verge of collapse, it's a country that's being reshaped in ways that will make it even harder to govern in the future. The real danger for the US isn't that Maduro will win, it's that Washington will keep pretending this is a problem with a military solution. The establishment still talks about Venezuela in terms of restoring democracy, as if the country can simply be rebooted to its pre-Chavez state. But that's not how history works. Venezuela in 2024 is not Venezuela in 1998. The old elites are gone. The old political parties are irrelevant. The old economic model is dead. And the old US playbook, sanctions, isolation, regime change, has failed. What's needed now is a recognition that Venezuela is entering a new phase, one where the US has to choose between two unpalatable: either accept the reality of Maduro's rule and try to manage it, or double down on a strategy that has already failed. The first option is politically toxic in Washington, where Venezuela has become a partisan football. The second option is strategically reckless, because it risks turning Venezuela into a permanent crisis, one that drains US resources and attention without delivering any tangible benefits. Let me be I'm not arguing that the US should abandon its principles or embrace Maduro. What I'm saying is that the current approach isn't working, and it's time to ask why. The answer isn't that the US isn't trying hard enough. It's that the world has changed, and Washington hasn't kept up. Venezuela is a case study in the limits of American power, not because the US is weak, but because the tools it's using are outdated. The question isn't whether Maduro will fall. It's whether the US will finally realize that the game has changed, and that the old rules no longer apply.